Day 10 of the 2024 FIDE Candidates saw the two co-leaders Jan Nepomniachtchi and Gukesh Domraju draw their individual game to maintain their lead in the tournament. Meanwhile, the two Americans, Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana, both won their games to get back into contention for the lead. Checking out the day's results, as mentioned, Nepo Gukesh ended in a fairly solid draw, as did Pragnananda against Vidit. But both Nakamura and Caruana managed to squeeze out wins in order to get back within a half point of the leaders. Heading into Wednesday's round 11, Nepo and Gukesh continued to lead with 6 out of 10, with Fabi, Naka, and Prag all on 5.5, and Vidit a full point behind the leaders on 5 out of 10. In the women's candidates, Lei Tingjie defeated yet another key rival in Alexandra Goryachkina in today's round, which allowed Lei to once again catch up with Tan Zhongyi in the standings, as they now both lead with 6.5 out of 10, with Goryachkina and Logno a full point behind on 5.5. Jumping into today's games, starting with the key battle between the two leaders, Nepo against Gukesh. Nepo goes for the Ruy Lopez this time, and Gukesh goes for the surprising Kozio defense with this early move, Knight G E7. Now, White has a couple of critical continuations here. I think both C3 and Knight C3 are the main moves, but Nepo goes for D4, which I believe is slightly offbeat. After takes, Black trades on D4, Queen D4, Knight C6, Queen to E3. Around here, Gukesh started tanking quite a bit, indicating that he was out of book, but objectively it seems like the position should be fine after the slightly weird bishop to D6, looking to put the bishop on E5, and even after Gukesh's move bishop to E7, things didn't seem that bad for Black. Now, the most aggressive approach here from White might have been to play something like bishop to D2 and try to even castle queenside, but Nepo plays it pretty solid with Knight C3 and Knight to D5. B5 is a response from Gukesh, and now Knight A5, and Gukesh plays this one very, very precisely, just going after the bishop on B3, looking to put the other bishop on B7 and slowly neutralize White's pressure. Queen G3 is played, bishop to D6 as the C7 pawn was hanging, bishop F4, we get a trade. Now after D6, castles, and bishop E6, Black essentially solves all their problems here. At this point, Gukesh goes rook E8, H3, H6. Some complications here, starting with rook D3, C5, rook to G3. White brings the rook over to the king side, but simple move here, king to H8. Now Black is starting to push C4, so White plays C3. Black finally trades on B3, takes on D5, and the players reach this heavy piece endgame where White's activity on the king side really isn't amounting to much. It's basically just about equal here, but if anything, Black might even be a touch better, the control over the e-file. That said, the game petered out rather quickly here after Queen D4, Queen A7. Gukesh goes for the rook endgame here with rook to E2. Okay, technically Jan trades on A7, rook takes A7, and now B4. And both sides have a couple of weaknesses, but really, really hard to generate any winning chances, as eventually all the pieces got traded off here, and the two players just ended up in a dead drawn rook endgame, and they eventually agreed to a draw here after trading off the queenside pawns and reaching move 40 when they're finally allowed to agree to a draw. Going to the game between Caruana and Fuja, this one definitely had a lot spicier action, starting with the open Sicilian. Fuja goes for the Najdorf, and Fabi plays this very trendy, very sharp line with rook to G1. Now Fuja plays H5, which is one of the main moves in this position, but after bishop C4, he starts thinking here, eventually goes for a dragon type of setup with G6 and bishop to G7. Caruana continues naturally here, Queen D2, castles queenside, Knight to C6, and at this point he goes Knight to B3, hitting Black's queen, and essentially inviting this endgame that we see in the game after Queen takes G5 and bishop to H6, where Black wins back the queen and material equalizes. Here Fabi goes H4, looking to take back on G5, and bishop E6. Now at this point, White had a surprising tactic with the move bishop takes E6, followed by E5. And the first point here is that if knight E5, there's F4. Breaking the pin, Black has to take on G5, and now after HG5, both the knights are hanging, and White is winning a piece. The other point here would be D takes E5. White can trade on H6, rook H6, and then play Knight C5, winning the pawn back with a really nice structure and a big advantage. Caruana misses this one. It is a very computer type of idea with bishop E6 and E5. Instead goes for bishop to E2, And after this point, Fuja definitely gets back into the game and gets close to equality. After f4, we finally get the bishop taking on g5, knight to g4, and white definitely retains some advantage here, but Fuja defends quite well here with f5, getting some counterplay in the center. And this game eventually comes down to a time scramble as the players go to move 40. Pieces start getting traded off here. FIDE does manage to win the d6 pawn, but black has a lot of counterplay here, a lot of compensation as the bishop is hitting g2. So now c5. At this point, Fuja might have missed a clear draw with rook d6, followed by rook to d8, where it's really difficult for white to hang on to this d-pawn, and black always has long-term counterplay against g2. So the engines think that black is doing all right here. Instead, h4 was played. At this point, both players under 10 minutes with 10 moves to go, and now Caruana plays this very precisely. Rook e7 check, rook to e5 going after the f-pawn, black goes rook h5, bishop f1 here, trades on d6 and starts bringing the rook back to deal with the d-pawn, but white is considerably ahead here. After rook e6 check and bishop to c4, Fuja goes rook to d8. Apparently king g7 was the move according to the engine, but rook d8 also makes sense as white doesn't have any immediate discovered attacks against the king. But now FIDE does have time to play king to e1, followed by king f2 and guard the g2 pawn. Note that black can't take on g2 because of rook e2 check. This would win the bishop. And here white is able to defend his main weakness and still use his extra pawn. So king g7 was played. At this point, both players just trying to get to the time control. King f2, a5, a3, and now white's advantage gets very big here after bishop to d3, bishop d5, rook e7 check, precise move from Caruana. The point is if black brings the king into king f6 or king f8, then rook e5 comes with tempo against the f-pawn and the bishop, but taking this one with check is the main idea. So bishop f7 is played, but now FIDE takes on b5, king f6, and very precise play here from Caruana. Rook c7, rook takes d6, and now rook to c6, forcing a trade into a same color bishop endgame where white has an extra pawn and completely winning position. The problem for black is that white has two plans. One is to advance the b pawn. The second is to tie black's king down to the f5 pawn and then bring white's king over to h3 in order to target the pawn on h4, and black simply can't defend against all these plans. Bishop b3 was played, stopping the b pawn, but now bishop to d7, king g6, king to g1, and Fuja actually resigned in this position as he has no good answer to king h2, king h3, followed by king takes h4. Black's king has to stay in contact with this pawn, and as soon as the bishop moves, well then white starts pushing b4, followed by b5, bishop to c6, and white is going to promote the b pawn. So in view of just this very simple plan that FIDE demonstrated with this move king to g1, Fuja resigned at this exact moment. Moving on to the game between Nakamura and Abbasov. This one started off as a Petrov defense, and Naka goes for the same line that Nepo chose in his game against Abbasov with d3 followed by d4, essentially transposing to the exchange French. In that game after c5, Nepo castled, allowing his bishop to get locked in with c4 and bishop e2. In this game, Naka goes for c3, which keeps his bishop on a much better diagonal. Bishop d6, castles was the continuation, h3, both sides just developing their pieces here, h6, bishop h4. At this point, black plays b5, which starts to give white an advantage here. g5 was possible, but black would have to contend with the sacrifice after knight g5 and bishop to g5, which looks incredibly dangerous, f4, queen f3 coming, and so on. But perhaps the move rook to e8 was the way for black to play in this position with a pretty solid game. Instead, we see b5 and black looking to develop the queen side, but now white definitely gets a certain initiative in the center of the board. Queen f3, knight e7, the rook on a6 defending f6, but now b3, Naka starts to open up the b file, takes, and eventually his rook does get to b1. After rook e6, knight to g4, takes, black was definitely under pressure here. He goes queen e8, bishop g3, bishop to a5. Here, Naka takes on e6, and after bishop takes e6, comes in with the rook to b7. At this point, bishop d6 is now a threat, and black has very serious problems. Here, black goes knight to c8, and Naka had a really strong opportunity here with the pawn advance g5. The main point here is to open up the h-file after hg, queen to h5. Black is having issues covering this mate on h7. If g6, white can take on g6, using that rook on b7 to deliver the checkmate. And after the move f5, for example, well, here white can take on g5, but even stronger is the knockout rook takes g7 check, which just leads to complete collapse after bishop to e5. Queen takes g5 is coming, and black is just losing all the material and then eventually getting mated. So on knight to c8, g5, likely black would have to play this move queen to c6, but still here after rook to b8, hg for example, white can go queen h5, take on g5, and have a very, very clear advantage. Bishop e5 coming, followed by knight to e3. It's not clear what Hikaru missed about this variation. Likely he was considering it, but couldn't quite figure out all the details, would be my best guess after queen to c6. Instead, he goes for bishop f4, much quieter move, but this allows black to get back into the game. So queen to c6, rook b8, knight e7, rook drops back to b1. And there was actually another chance here with bishop to h7 check. I'll just point out this line. If king takes h7, rook takes f8. My guess is both players saw the line with knight to g6 here, hitting the rook and the bishop on f4. Rook has to go out to b8. And now after knight takes f4, queen takes f4, bishop to c7, black would be completely winning here if not for the very nice, very computery resource queen to c1, with the idea that bishop takes b8 is met with queen b1 check. White wins back the material, and in this game, in this position, white should be better. He's got queen a7 coming, going after the a3 pawn, in case a bishop takes g4, for example, and it looks like white has a solid plus in this position. In the game after rook to b1, black actually takes over here, starting with the move queen to d7, bishop to g4, and h5. At this point, all of black's pieces are coming out, and if anything, it's white who's worse, having to defend the c-pawn. Knight to g6, bishop h2, rook e8. But Naka finds a very nice trick in the position. Rook e2 is now played, rook check, king h7, queen c1. It looks like black is dominating, and here Abbasov makes the most natural move in the position, queen to e7, defending a3, eyeing the g-pawn, and supporting the rook on the e-file. What he should have done instead was this move bishop to c7, and then black, it seems, has a clear advantage. After the trade on c7, queen takes c7, white is very passive here, and black is doing quite well. But once again, he goes for this more natural move, queen to e7, likely underestimating Naka's response here, bishop to e5. Taking advantage of the pin on the diagonal, the knight can't take the bishop, and now black's rook is in trouble as white is turning knight to g3, winning the exchange. I think h4 here might have been the move for black, but he goes queen e6, allowing knight to g3. He sacrifices on e5, and at first glance, this does look completely fine for black as he gets the first pawn and he's about to get the second pawn as white's rook is hanging. But Hikaru had seen further, and he finds a very nice sequence, rook to b5, and now queen to e3, a fantastic move. And it turns out that black cannot hold on to the d-pawn, because white is threatening the queen. The d-pawn can't be pushed because of the pin. And after queen takes e3, f takes e3, the d-pawn is hanging. If black defends this one with bishop to e6, then white has moves like knight e2, for example, but also you can take on h5, followed by knight to f4, and black doesn't have enough here for the exchange, and white is close to winning. In the game, we saw d4, which is probably the best try, but takes, and this endgame turns out to be basically impossible for black to hold. White's rook is just too strong on the open board, and it's really hard for black to hold on to this a-pawn, which means that in the long run, white gets this a-pawn passer. Here, Naka wins the pawn right away, and although black has some counterplay on the king side, it's really not enough. There's not enough coordination here, and white's a-pawn is simply much faster, and Naka here definitely shows very solid technique to get the job done. Bishop f5, looking to trade some pieces. Takes, bishop g5, a5, and black resigned here as the a-pawn is unstoppable. He can try to push the c-pawn, but the knight will be able to stop this one, and that's it. White's pawn is running through. So with this win, Naka was able to join both FIDE and Prague to be just a half point behind the two leaders. Speaking of Prague, he was white today against Vidit, and this was a pretty solid game coming out of the Berlin defense. Here he trades on c6 and goes for the structure that we've seen in the tournament a couple times, but generally black has been doing fine. This game was interesting, but not a ton of fireworks here. Eventually we get this trade on d6. This is reminiscent of the game between Gukesh and Prague from yesterday that had a similar piece configuration, with both sides having a queen, 2 rooks, knight, and opposite colored bishops. Here after c5, bishop to b7, we get the trade on e6. And these middle games can be quite sharp, but there was really not much for white to play for here. Eventually, Prague does go for the queen trade, queen to g3. Finally, Vidit trades queens. And yeah, basically in this endgame, it was very, very difficult to see how either side could possibly make progress. The players do maneuver around here for a bit, but eventually do find the repetition with rook e2, and yeah, just going back and forth here. After rook f2, king b7, the draw was finally agreed. Finally, we have the key game in the women's candidates from this round, with Lei Tingjie playing black against Alexandra Goryachkina. This one started off as an exchange Slav, and for the most part, things were very, very solid here out of the opening. But eventually the game does heat up. Black manages to get the bishop pair here, but white is still completely fine. Knight a4, fighting for the c-file. King goes to f7. And here after h4, bishop h2, queen d7, the game does get very tactical. Knight b6, queen to b5, queen c7, black grabs this pawn, bishop d6, and now rook to e8. And here Goryachkina makes a surprising mistake in the move rook to c1. This looks like the most natural move in the world, bringing the rook to the open file, but this allows Lei a very, very clever trick with king to g6, unpinning on the 7th rank. And it turns out that the rook is hanging on c1. So after bishop e7, black just takes back. If white takes this one on e7, then black takes the rook on c1 and is actually winning there, as white's queen doesn't have a lot to do, but black's queen is going to come to d2 and then go after the e-pawn, and it's going to be white's king that's in a ton of danger. So other than this move rook to c1, white basically could have moved the rook anywhere else where it wouldn't be active, but it also wouldn't be hanging, and not allowing black to untangle with the king. So from this point, black is able to take the initiative and hold on to the extra pawn. It's funny, the rook here is left hanging for some time, as white's rook on c1 is also caught. Rook d7, queen c3, queen to b4. And the game does turn a couple of times here. Black keeps the advantage for the most part. Eventually we do get this endgame with another funny move, rook d6, threatening rook c6. Here white finally takes, black takes on c1, and eventually the queens do come off here. After f3, queen f2, check, and g5, queen c7, black plays queen to g3 check. White wins a pawn here, but the knight on f8 is trapped after e5, with black now threatening king to g7, picking up the knight. So Goryachkina finds the only chance here, e4, takes. Now black apparently should have taken this one and would be winning the endgame, but Lei's choice, bishop c8, also makes sense, trying to keep the knight trapped. But now d5 comes in. The knight gets out via e6, king f7, but black is still definitely better here, as the bishop is stronger than the knight in this endgame, and the pawn on a4 is an easy target. So king f2, b6, and here both sides start getting their counterplay going, with white getting the h-pawn, black taking on a4. This endgame was very, very sharp, but also very difficult for white to hold. That said, Goryachkina finds a lot of the key moves here, first ditching her h-pawn, and then getting her knight to help the d-pawn run through. The problem for white here is that even though she gets d7 and forces black to give up the bishop, black is now having 3 pawns for the knight, including 2 passed pawns on the queen side and at least 1 passed pawn on the king side, and this is really hard for the knight to deal with. So a3, b5 is the continuation, king to b3 and b4. These pawns now defend each other, because king takes b4 would allow a2 and the pawn promotes. So king a2, and after f5 here, Goryachkina makes the ultimate blunder with knight takes e5. This ends up losing the game, because after king to f4, knight d3 check, king takes e4, knight takes b4, and now f4. Surprisingly, white is losing this position, as the knight is not able to get back in time to stop the f-pawn. So if we go back a couple moves after f5, white did have a couple ways to draw this. E takes f5 would have been the most direct. For example, after king takes f5, knight c5, white is in time here with e4, the knight can first grab the b pawn and then reach the c2 square just in time to stop the e pawn. White's king will take this pawn on a3, and from there we have a very easy draw. So definitely that was hard to find at this point. Goryachkina had about a minute on her clock, just playing on the 30-second increment. And yeah, very, very difficult decision to make. She goes for knight takes e5, but Lei finds a very strong and only winning move in the position, king to f4. Of course, if ef5, then king takes e5, and that's completely over as well. And so the game saw knight d3, knight b4, and f4. Knight a6 was tried, but now f3, check, king to e3. And here white resigned, as the knight just has no chances of stopping the f-pawn. Black is going to get a new queen, and of course that endgame is completely lost. So with that, we head into tomorrow's rest day. Round 11 will take place on Wednesday, April 17, and we've got some big pairings. Gukesh white against Caruana, Vidit white against Nepomniachtchi, Praggnanandhaa white against Nakamura, and finally Fuja white against Abbasov. Should be a very, very exciting final stretch to the tournament, as we've only got 4 rounds left until we get a new challenger for the World Championship. Hopefully you folks enjoyed this recap, and until next time, take care.